what you find when you actually discuss these things and look at, okay, what can aging entail? What might my future entail? It's not all the worst stuff that everyone fears and pictures. There are also a lot of good things that happen with aging. There's a mix of things that happen. And one of the fundamental things that I think is inescapable is that with time and with aging, there's change. So in some ways, it's not about worse or better, but it is about change and an acceptance that things can change, but not thinking that it's only change for the negative, because it's not.
This is Coming of Age, Meeting the Needs of Our Aging Population, a podcast about how we can better support our seniors. I'm your host, Donna Duncan. I am also the CEO of the Ontario Long-Term Care Association, which represents about 70% of long-term care homes in Ontario, Canada. This episode was generously sponsored by our sector champion, Plan A, powered by StaffStat. Plan A, powered by StaffStat, is the only staffing strategy in Canada focused specifically on seniors' care. It marries people and culture to innovation to help long-term care and retirement homes optimize their staffing. Learn more about their mission to ensure senior care organizations across Canada have access to a strategy that keeps their frontline employees supported and their residents safe and cared for. Visit www.jointheateam.com. Welcome to a new episode of Coming of Age. One of the things we don't talk about much when we talk about aging is mental health and well-being. But when we avoid talking about how mental health can affect our lives, and especially when we add fear and denial of aging to the mix, we end up fueling the problem. Today, I'm hopeful my discussion with psychiatrist Dr. Sonu Gand will help spark new conversations and inspire hope for the future as we age. Dr. Gand is the chief of the Department of Psychiatry at the world-class Sunnybrook Health Sciences Centre in Toronto, Canada. He is a staunch mental health advocate who is actively involved in health policy development and advocacy, and he has been recognized with numerous Canadian and international awards for his teaching, advocacy, and impact. In our episode, we explore how conquering our fear and focusing on hope and acceptance are integral in maintaining mental well-being as we age. We also touch on some of the tools, policies, and systems needed to support us all in aging well. Let's dive in. Dr. Gand, I have to say we are absolutely delighted to have you part of our podcast today as we explore the interconnections between mental health and aging. I have a history in the mental health space, having worked at the Centre for Addiction Mental Health in Toronto, Canada, as well as run a large children's mental health organization. And it's taken the pandemic to really start to normalize and make it okay to talk about mental health issues. And we're making progress. Do you feel that there is a healthy public discussion about mental health and aging now? Or are we still trying to navigate the stigma of aging, but also the stigma of mental illness?
First, let me thank you for your gracious invitation to participate in this. I think these are very important conversations. And the question you raise at the beginning is actually a fundamental one. My answer to it would be, I think we're a work in progress right now. So I don't think we're where we need to be. There definitely are gaps in a few things I'll mention now, but I also have seen some progress. And you mentioned the issue of the discussions and discourse we have in society, both about mental health and mental illness and about aging, and the issue of stigma. And unfortunately, it is something where in both mental health and in aging, there does continue to be a significant amount of stigma that people suffer from. This has all sorts of consequences because it impacts not just the person, but it also impacts how they internalize things and how they view themselves. But at the same time, what I would say is that there is increasing not just awareness of these issues, but also, I think, an increasing sense of unacceptability of stigma against mental illness and mental health issues and against essentially ageism. Now, we have a long way to go, but as I'm saying, I do think we've made some progress. And unfortunately, one of the things that leads to that progress is when a light shines on something that people have not wanted to see or have almost refused seeing. And the COVID pandemic did that. It showed us what some of our terrible gaps were in terms of how we actually help our most elderly live dignified lives. That raised a lot of eyebrows, raised a lot of discomfort. And what I'm hoping is that it also keeps a lens on some things that need continued improvement.
It's such a great point. In one of our earlier seasons, Katie Smith Sloan from Leading Age in the United States made the point we invest in what we value. And what we've seen not only in Canada, but around the world is the toll that COVID took on our aging population. For better or worse, it shone a light on the fact that we failed to invest in our older population. One of the side effects, though, that we're certainly seeing and experiencing, whether it's on social media or in mainstream media or even in discussions, is a fear of aging now and a fear of what that means for me as an individual, as well as for my family. And in some cases, we're also seeing people just not wanting to talk about it or acknowledge what aging actually means. Are we prepared as a society to be psychologically prepared for aging and what that really means?
So it's fascinating how you frame that because I think you are very astutely linking together some key issues here that are interrelated. And you mentioned fear, you mentioned avoidance, as in not wanting to talk about things, and you started with stigma. And when you think about it, all three of those are unfortunately parts of a problematic chain that often occurs, a problematic process or wheels that spin. And I think you're right that to some degree it can start with the fear. And what is that fear based on? The fear is based on what people look around and may see and may register and think that, oh, I remember this terrible thing I saw. I remember someone that's a loved one's loved one or a friend's loved one going through a terrible experience. And that creates all sorts of anxiety and fear, including our own projections about what might happen in our future, the future of my family, etc. But those things don't reflect what unfolds for everyone. We tend to focus and have biases on, but we will often focus and have a bias towards things that are more negative. They register. You've heard that saying that bad news sells. There's a reason for that. People perk their ears up. It registers, and it unfortunately then fuels fears of the worst. This is what I'm fearing. And then what happens when people have that fear? They don't want to talk about it. It's not pleasant. And so they avoid it. That leads to your other comment about, is there an absence of adequate discussion? And I think there is an absence of adequate discussion. We do need to be discussing these things. But what you find when you actually discuss these things and look at, okay, what can aging entail? What might my future entail? It's not all the worst stuff that everyone fears and pictures. There are also a lot of good things that happen with aging. There's a mix of things that happen. And one of the fundamental things that I think is inescapable is that with time and with aging, there's change. So in some ways, it's not about worse or better, but it is about change and an acceptance that things can change, but not thinking that it's only change for the negative, because it's not. But again, the fear shuts down that thought process and it shuts out that discussion. And then it can lead to the third thing you mentioned right at the beginning, which is the stigma. Because what is stigma? Stigma tends to be a set of beliefs or a sense of judgments or values that we make and that we have. And sometimes we don't even know why we have them. A lot of times when you look at things that people have stigmatized attitudes towards, and you challenge them, and you actually bring in information to challenge them, people's attitudes can change. And so a lot of times stigma is a consequence of these lack of discussions. And then getting to that final point about how does it play out and how does society value things, the next step to stigma is what? When stigma gets acted out or translated to policy, to things we do in institutions, to resources and funding, it becomes something that's more than just an attitude. It becomes something that impacts people's lives. It becomes behaviors and even discrimination, potentially. And so all of these things are interlinked, but I'm not saying this to suggest that it's a link that can't be addressed. I actually think that when you look at those links, each of those things have factors that can be addressed, and we do need more healthy discussions.
It's so interesting having discussions. And again, people keep defaulting back to March of 2020 and those very stark images. And yet we know even today in Ontario, Canada, the long-term care we're building, the new long-term care, the new supports for our aging demographic actually don't look and feel at all like what was experienced in the darkest moments even 3 years ago. And yet, I've certainly had conversations with individuals who have said, I've told my family, I've had a discussion with my family where I've told them that if I get a diagnosis of dementia, then I'm going to revert to medically assisted aid in dying. And for our international listeners, it's a form of euthanasia as it's named in Canada, and the use of it is expanding. We're certainly seeing that. I know, Dr. Gand, that you watched a film at the Toronto International Film Festival, a Japanese film called Plan 75, that, to your point, actually more or less codified an end-of-life policy in this dystopic world in this film, and where at the age of 75, individuals would receive euthanasia at that certain age. And that's pretty stark commentary about the value of our aging demographic. And to your point, each one of us is going to age differently. There are younger people who will become ill. There are older people who we have more centenarians on the planet today than we ever had before. And the journey is very different. And I know you give a lot of thought to social psychiatry. How do we reframe the value proposition of aging? We see it as a negative. We see it as a withdrawal on so many fronts. Yet to your point, there's such an opportunity to reframe this and start to talk about it from a more of a positive lens.
I actually think that in answer to that, many of the same issues we just discussed need to be brought into play. And part of it does have to do with addressing discussions and stigma, which leads to, as you were pointing out, the value equation. What do we place as value on not just aging, but lives of the elderly? Because at the end of the day, that's part of what this discussion ends up being about. And I do think that this idea that people have that if I get to this point, I don't want to be here anymore. Again, a lot of that is based on fear and anxiety, as we were talking about. Remember that dementia, it is something that affects people in serious ways, and it can be very serious for some and milder for others. And also remember that most people do not get dementia. It's not that everyone gets dementia. In fact, most do not get dementia. And so just reflect on that for a minute, that if most people, or if everyone is projecting ahead, that, oh, this is what I'm worried about and fearing, and in that situation, I would want something like medically assisted dying. what does that actually say about what we're reflecting on and projecting ahead? Again, it's fear-based in that sense. The other thing we find is that when people actually experience things, including things they don't want to, including adverse things, and this could be a loss from anything. It could be a loss associated with aging, but it could be a loss associated with an accident. It could be various things that come up in life. People don't know how they're going to react to that initially, and they often, 6 months, a year, 2 years down the line, say that I would have never thought I could have coped with this. And now I've adjusted. And we don't know what our adjustments to future circumstances will be. So this is one of my concerns about when people feel that I know what I will want in 20 years. I don't know what I'm going to want in 2 years. It makes it challenging that way. And to your point about whether people would choose something like, I don't want to be here anymore at all in these circumstances, it's a complex discussion. It definitely is. There are many things, many factors that go into people's wishes for what they want out of life, for their wishes of what they may want out of death. But there are obviously and very clear concerns that issues of ageism and stigma and a decreased sense of value of lives of the elderly could play out in negative ways on people choosing to have an assisted death. I'll give you one statistic, which I think to me is troubling, at least, from our reporting in 2021, which is the last year we have it from. Over 1/3 of people who chose MAID in that framework, before even the big expansion we're having, but 1/3 of people indicated that a key element of their suffering that they're seeking this for is related to feeling a sense of burden to their family and to society. So what does that say? We need to think about these things in a very mindful way. So it's a challenging discussion, but I'm glad you raised it.
When I think back to the people with whom I had the privilege of working in children's mental health, we talked a lot about neuroplasticity and the fact that we could change our brains, and that using tools and reframing our thinking, we could change the outcome in a very positive way in terms of the physiology of our brain. I remember a clinical psychologist, Dr. Robin Alter, wrote a book called The Gift of Imagination, with the premise being that harnessed in a very positive way, instead of going into dark places, but thinking in a very different kind of way through structured psychotherapy, you could steer the imagination of a child in a way that, again, because their brain is still evolving, could result in them better managing their mental health and mental well-being as they aged and as they evolved. So being in the moment as opposed to having your imagination take you into dark places. I'm curious as to whether the science is showing that the brain can positively adapt as we age, because the discourse really is your brain is evolving until your early 20s, and then that's it.
So it's funny you say that, because if you had asked me this years ago, my answer would have been different. And the reason it would have been different is because in our anatomy class, I distinctly remember the professor, that while I was a medical student, saying that, look, you better take care of your brain, which I agree with. We should all take care of our brains, but you better take care of your brain now, because once you hit like 25 type thing, nothing's going to change or get better. And it was almost like a message that it's all downhill from there and things don't change. And whatever neuroplasticity we have stops at that point. None of that is true. What we now know is that, in fact, neuroplasticity continues even as we age. It changes. The things in the brain that change do vary over time. And this is part of what then gets related to the differences in functioning that we see. People will often focus on some of the obvious and known changes that happen with age, which is some loss of short-term memory, for example, right? So that's something where it is true that there can be some elements of memory loss in specific areas with age. But that's very different from dementia. That's one point I'll make. And actually, just as a side note, I think that might be one reason why the fear is fueled so powerfully, because people will often experience what is absolutely normal and not harmful, mild short term memory loss. And then they will run all the way to the end thinking, oh, this means I have or will have dementia. And that's actually not the case. So some element of mild memory loss can happen with aging, but there are other positive elements as well that occur. What we find is that people can cope with things in different ways. It probably is maybe too broad a word to say, but the idea of wisdom, meaning the combination of total knowledge and awareness, which tends to increase, and then also how to process it changes. What we're finding is that even in things like attention is not a single one factor phenomena. So what we're paying attention to, and if something changes, what registers. People have often thought our attention and ability to pay attention goes down. It's not as clear as that. In some facets of attention, it actually seems to improve. In others, it goes down a bit. And another thing that's very interesting is that the sense of what we perceive and the valence we place on it, meaning, is it positive, is it negative? Is this hurtful and harmful or painful versus is this either joyous or is this okay and I can deal with it? That changes, that resilience changes. And people will often register less of the negative in things as they age, which again is interesting when you go back to the initial question that you asked about when I'm younger and I'm fearing something, how might I respond to that? Even my response to the same situation 20, 30 years from now might be different. And what I'd encourage is, there's an entire area of positive aging, positive psychiatry. There are a lot of things that are associated with that are not just medical. It's not just about medical issues. It's about various things related to health and lifestyle. There's a good resource for people out it's developed out east. I'm not sure if it's Nova Scotia, but it's the Fountain of Health. So it would be fountainofhealth.ca, I think it would be. And that actually has some good discussion of various issues related to aging, including things that reflect principles of positive aging.
It's so interesting that you talk about those other elements, that more of that biopsychosocial approach and that lens. What is your sense of what we already know about the impact of isolation and loneliness on someone's mental health and being and from as they age? And what do you think we need to be preparing for? Or are there things that we can be doing from more of a positive perspective to counteract any potential negative impacts?
So my short answer is, are there things we can be doing? I would say yes. And before getting to the longer answer, I'll rewind a little bit because I think this is intimately related and tied of necessity to how we value people and whether we value people as we age, as they age. Therefore, it also has considerations of ageism, right? Because if there's strong elements of ageism, that means we don't value people. And the reason that I'm saying that is that when we talk about psychosocial interventions or psychosocial care or psychosocial issues, those require people. What's an antidote to loneliness? It's not a robot, it's people. It's not a pill, it's people. And so in that sense, if we're talking about loneliness as an issue, especially in the context of our elderly population, if we're actually going to address that, we need to counter it by providing some ways of people having companionship and people around them, which means we need to then value resources to provide for that. So that's why I'm linking it back to that initially. But then in terms of the impacts of loneliness and what can be done about it, the Surgeon General in the States, Vivek Murthy, just a few months ago, I think it was, he released a report that talks about how devastating the impact of loneliness and isolation is, and actually called it an epidemic. and especially on the elderly. And in terms of the impacts on health, not just psychological health, but even physical health, there are numerous studies. There's a lot of evidence now well established that shows that loneliness is dangerous. And loneliness is especially dangerous for our elderly. It reduces overall health, increases health morbidity. Some have even gone so far as to say, and there's good reason for this, I think the evidence does support it, that there are also links to earlier mortality, not just morbidity, but even mortality. Some countries have instituted or implemented ministers or ministries of loneliness. The UK and Britain, they implemented that. I think it was even before the pandemic, actually. And in Japan, they have a minister of loneliness. I would raise the question here. Should we actually think about something like that where we have a portfolio in our federal government that actually says we need to look at these things, federal and or provincial governments, ministries or minister of loneliness portfolio? Because when you have something like that, it does a few things. It forces eyes to be placed on the problem. It can't be swept under the carpet in that sense. It produces an accountability because now there's a group that has responsibility for looking at this and implementing it. And crucially, it allows for resource flow and resource allocation to actual initiatives that must be done. Because honestly, it is essential to have these discussions. That's where it starts. But that can't be where it ends, because talking about this stuff won't actually change the loneliness of the people we're talking about. We need to actually do something about that. And we can, but then we need to value it.
It's such an interesting approach because it is more of a population-based approach. It's cross-functional by definition, requires multiple levels of government and cross-ministerial and departmental collaboration, because it's not necessarily this box. Whereas what we look at certainly today is here's a hospital, here's a long-term care home. We're not thinking about it from a population-based approach, which is a much more holistic approach to supporting people in their local communities. And especially in Canada, where we have the gift and the challenge of our geography, and where you see the migration of younger people out of rural and northern communities, the people who would normally become the family caregiver. And if they're not in their local community for whatever reason, then who will be there to support the individuals who remain behind, who really are the ones who built their communities? And so who's going to support them on this journey?
Well, and look, this is precisely why we can't only be looking at this as we get older, how will you help treat my diabetes? As we get older, how will you help treat my heart condition? As we get older, if I have some cognitive decline, how will you deal with that? In my view, what that does is it reduces us and it reduces our aging population to illnesses. And in my view, aging is not an illness. It's something we all are going through or will be going through. And we know that if we actually look at the holistic approach, as you're talking about, in a population-based approach, there are things that can help reduce the negative sides of it and actually help encourage and have the positive sides flourish. That's what a lot of the positive aging and positive psychiatry aspects are for. How do you actually pull out those things? And a lot of that involves non-medical interventions.
It's such an opportunity for us to reframe the discussion. And it is those little things that can add up and make such a difference as we think about how we value someone, how we engage someone, how do we support them in continuing to contribute, and how do we keep them anchored in that positive moment and to be able to be open to those moments of joy instead of worrying about and anticipating something that may never happen, and really anchoring us in the possibilities, quite honestly. I love your framing of that. One thing I want to touch on is In this new world where more people are talking about their mental health and well-being, more people are coming forward and potentially receiving diagnoses. We see people with chronic mental illness. One of the things we've not really been seeing in our world of long-term care is, what does it mean to support someone who's aging with a chronic mental illness, and what supports might they need that could conceivably be different than others who may require more structured support in a long-term care setting? So we've spoken about dementia. We know that the average age of an individual coming into our long-term care homes in Ontario is 81, and they're presenting with multiple medical diagnoses and conditions. We tend to conflate the behaviors of dementia and mental illness into one, but we really haven't had more specific discussions about how do we support those individuals who may have received institutionalized care for severe mental illness. How do we support them on their aging journey? Are the supports going to be different for them that we need? Are there other considerations that we need to be making as we seek to support them? We're certainly very worried about even our own capacity around more specialized psychiatric support for geriatric psychiatry to support the very special needs of a population in a long-term care or other care setting as they age. Would welcome your insights on that. It's not the discussion that we're seeing happening right now, quite honestly.
It is a challenging area, and it's interesting that it loops a little bit back to what you asked right at the beginning about the overlap or the double effect of potentially mental illness issues and aging, and then how does that play out. But in terms of how we support people who are experiencing that, I think the first thing is we need to actually properly identify and assess what's going on. And one of the things that we do know is that, yes, when people are elderly, they can still have and suffer from various mental illnesses, whether it's mood disorder like depression or bipolar or other things. But what we find is that the presentation of that sometimes changes. For lack of a better word, you might call the classic textbook presentation of somebody with depression can be quite different in someone who is elderly versus when they're 40 or 50 years old. And what that also leads to is that it sometimes gets missed, everything that gets conflated together. And people don't really know whether what's going on, is this because of a mental illness and symptoms from that? Is this because of other regular natural aging issues? Is it some social reaction to some other recent loss? Is it dementia related? And it's left that way. And then we try to manage. So how do you manage what you don't know is a question. It's very hard to. And so this is why I'm saying that one of the first things amongst healthcare providers and the system needs to be adequate recognition of what's going on, including being able to assess some of those differences and the nuances and the different presentations. That actually goes in two ways, because one is, yes, you can have the issue of someone who has had a mental illness that might have recurred in the past and now is back again. And then you have some clues there that it's happened before. But sometimes you can have somebody develop depression, mental illness, who has not had it before. And in those cases especially, it is sometimes not thought about. I've heard this many times, that, oh, yeah, Mr. X, he's never suffered from depression before. And almost in parentheses, it's as if, how could he be suffering from it now when he's 80 years old? And of course you can be. And the kicker to that is that when Mr. X is 80, it might be different than what the doctor thought they would see when Mr. X was 40. So one of the things is this recognition and awareness, so we can properly address an illness if it is there, and address and treat the illness symptoms. Sometimes that may involve medication. Other times it may not involve medication. We actually know that various forms of psychotherapy can be as effective as medication in some situation and can actually have a biological effect. So think about that. Psychotherapies, without putting any medication in a person's body, can also have a biological effect. And so this shows the interrelatedness of what we're dealing with here. But it has to be identified because you want to make sure that the person is getting the proper psychotherapy, for example. And in terms of illness, if we're talking the illness piece, there are also a lot of very promising treatments that we are having and seeing in mental health and psychiatry. We're working on some of them at Sunnybrook that are looking at novel ways of treating some of these things without either medication, but with things like neuromodulation, various things like that. So involving actually addressing the illness, identifying it, and then addressing it. And then the third component would be recognizing that in managing all of this, whatever component is illness and what isn't, it does require a team. And there's a reason that both in child and youth psychiatry and in geriatric psychiatry, there are acknowledged and known values and benefits of needing to have both a team on the medical side, but also looking at the person not just either as an illness or even an individual person, but in whatever social situation they're in, and addressing the issues that might be related to that. You can think about it as bookends at both at the child and youth side and the geriatric side. The importance of those connections becomes paramount. And if you're not looking at those and dealing with those, you're missing something
A great point that I'd love to wrap us up on, because it is one that I think gives us hope. And it's the innovation that can come through research, through neuroimaging. I know at Sunnybrook Hospital, really a pioneer in focused ultrasound and its opportunities, the work that is being done with the penetrating the blood-brain barrier, things I don't think anybody could even conceived of even 10 years ago, are moving very quickly. Perhaps not quickly enough for some, but we also have new medications being approved for Alzheimer's and dementia to stave it off at least. Are you hopeful?
Oh, I absolutely am hopeful. And I'm not hopeful only because I'm a bit of an eternal optimist. It's not only that, I can also be a skeptic at times. I'm hopeful because of a few reasons. One is what I see happening now and the promise of it. And again, not to overstate this, there's a reason that things may take time because we need to make sure that they work. We need to make sure they don't have unintended consequences, etc. But some of the things that we're seeing now, I couldn't have imagined when I was in medical school. And it almost seems almost like magic when you think about some of this stuff, but it's all based in physics, actually, which is even better than magic. But there's huge promise in those areas. So that's one reason I'm hopeful. The other reason I'm hopeful is what I've seen in my own career. Again, this issue of how does society value things? How do we think about things? What stigmas are there? When I started in psychiatry, I probably left some rooms without telling people I was a psychiatrist because it would be a conversation stopper. It would then be an awkward silence, and that's it. And at the same time, my clinical background is also psycho-oncology in particular, so cancer and psychological issues, and I'd worked with Princess Margaret for a while. And the evolution I've seen has occurred in both those areas because I also remember a time, even in oncology, where people wouldn't mention cancer. They wouldn't say the word cancer. It was highly stigmatized, which is now something you think about and think, how or why could that be? That's the point with most stigmas. They shouldn't be there. But we now have the Walk for the Cure, and we have all sorts of things that actually are focusing on let's address this problem, deal with it openly. And with mental illness and mental health, we're seeing an increasing appetite to talk about those things. So now, at the end of talks and sessions, it's invariably people gather around and want to talk about an experience they've had or something with a family member or something that's come up. And there's actually a desire to talk about, an appetite to talk about issues related to mental health and illness. That helps combat the stigma. And in the whole issue of aging and whether we have hope that we can offer in terms of future treatments, if you don't have that initial sense of value that these things are worthwhile doing, you're not going to pursue them. And so I see an alignment with all of this, that there is an exciting field out there of stuff that's still in exploration, but promising. And I also see it being increasingly driven by what I'm hoping are positive values that combat the stigmas that there have been for ageism for a long time.
Well, thank you so much for your leadership, for your inspiration, for your commitment, your compassion, and your belief in the possibilities. Really appreciate your time, Dr. Gant, and it's just been such a privilege to be joined by you today.
Thank you very much. I'm very grateful and appreciative to be part of these important discussions. And thank you for having them, because I think they're essential. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Coming of Age, the podcast that is changing the conversation on seniors' care and aging. We hope this episode brings a new perspective and inspires you to continue the conversation with your colleagues, friends, and family. Be sure to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast so that more listeners will join our community of changemakers in seniors' care. Until next time, I'm your host, Donna Duncan. Keep well.